Caramba, o Eduardo vai apresentar a live hoje de camiseta. Nada disso, eu tô de férias, turma. 2 semaninhas, eu tava precisando tanto. A saúde pegou esse ano, foi difícil, assim, manter o mínimo de saúde adequada para conseguir levar toda essa nossa caminhada, com todo esse empenho que a gente levou, com toda essa nossa força, com todo esse nosso direcionamento e enfrentamento. E tem uma hora que a saúde grita, né? Então eu tirei alguns diazinhos aí para poder recuperar. E durante essas semanas, são poucas semanas, vocês vão ter aulas incríveis com os maiores professores e professoras do ICL, que estão entre os maiores intelectuais do mundo. A gente está falando de Noam Chomsky, Leonardo Boff, está falando de Wolfgang Schluttland, estamos falando do querido Gessé, enfim, nomes incríveis. E uma surpresa, ao final dessas aulas, que são aulas históricas, aulas exclusivas para quem é membro e membra do ICL, que vocês vão poder assistir hoje e nos próximos dias, ao final da aula, quem se inscrever no ICL no plano anual vai ganhar de presente entregue em casa a minha trilogia Desvendando o Capitalismo. Aproveita a chance de assistir essa aula histórica, que é exclusiva para membros do ICL. E no final, aproveita a chance para vir para o ICL também. Essa revolução precisa de você. Um abraço e boa aula.
I'm very pleased to have this chance to meet with you. I wish it could have been in person, but at least we can appreciate second best. Naturally, I would like to talk about matters that are on your mind. Thanks very much for the suggestions that you sent. I wish that these meetings could be interactive. Discussion, comments, questions, criticisms. Unfortunately, circumstances don't allow it, so I'll try to make the best of what is possible. I think it would be a good idea to start with the most urgent of the suggestions that you sent me, the challenges ahead. These challenges are severe. There has been nothing like them in human history. There have been dire challenges before. Some of the most severe were actually in my childhood in the early 1930s. I'm old enough to remember Hitler's speeches at the Nuremberg rallies and scenes of stormtroopers marching through the streets. Some of what is happening today reawakens these memories. Historians of fascism have compared the assault on the US Capitol on January 6th to Hitler's beer hall putsch of 1923. That was quickly put down, and it was dismissed as unimportant, mistakenly, as the world found out a few years later. It's worth thinking about in the light of the coup attempt, which is what it was on January 6th. Well, Brazilians have more recent memories, or at least they should have them. The brutality of the military coup of 1964 has been erased from memory for much of the population. As you know better than I do, the current president hails the coup as a great moment in history although he does have criticisms. He condemned the military for being too soft. They should have followed the model of Argentina, where 30,000 people were killed. Unfortunately, in his mind, the military in Brazil was not up to that achievement. Well, if there's time, I'll come back to the role of the United States in the 1964 coup, and also the very instructive official reaction to the coup, and more importantly, to its place in the broader historical setting. But let's go back to the 1930s. The first article I remember writing was in February 1939, at the time of the fall of Barcelona. It was about the apparently unstoppable spread of fascism. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Toledo, Barcelona. It looked like there was no end to it. It seemed that Nazism would take Eurasia, who knows what beyond. I couldn't know at the time, of course, but in later years it was discovered that US government analysts had a pretty similar picture at the time. There was a major study, State Department, Council of Foreign Relations, the main non-governmental agency dealing with foreign affairs, had studies proceeding called the War Peace Studies, in which right through the war, 39 to 1945, in which they were evaluating the state of the world and laying plans for what would emerge. And in those early years, their picture was that the war would end with two states in control. There would be a German-controlled world, a Nazi-controlled world, and an American-controlled world. The American-controlled world, they concluded, would include what they called a grand area that the US must maintain. It, of course, included Latin America, included the former British Empire, which the US would take over with Britain collapsing, most parts of Asia. That would be the grand area. The rest would be Nazi controlled. That picture was pretty much maintained till 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad, where for the first time the Nazi forces were beaten back. The huge tank battle, a little later at Kursk, where the Russians destroyed major Nazi divisions. At that point, it was clear that Russia was going to defeat Germany, and the picture of the planners changed. The grand area under US control was to extend over as much of the world as possible, certainly including the industrial heartland of Europe and Western Central Europe. That's pretty much the shape of the world since. Those are the plans that are implemented in the post-war period, have led up to the present day. I'll return to that. The 1930s were a frightening time, but there was hope. In the 1930s, there were basically two choices. One was fascism, choice followed by continental Europe under Nazi, Italian control by Japanese fascism in Asia. The other option was social democracy. The New Deal in the United States FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that led the way in those years, laid much of the basis for the social democratic changes that took place in the post-war period. That was a frightening time. Today is an even more frightening time. Literal survival is at stake. But as in the 1930s, there is hope. While we are reviewing the desperate state of the world, and desperate is not too strong a term, we should keep firmly in mind that there are feasible solutions to every problem that we face. There are attempts to evaluate the current state of world affairs. The best known is the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. It was established shortly after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki 76 years ago. The bombing of Nagasaki was exactly 76 years ago, as I am recording these words on August 9th, grim day in human history. There's a good case to be made that the bombing of Nagasaki was the most hideous experiment in history, an experiment to see if a different kind of bomb would actually work. One can at least debate the motives for the Hiroshima bomb. There is no credible excuse for bombing Nagasaki. This was the day after Russia had invaded Manchuria, ending the last slim hope of Japanese militarists of some outcome other than total capitulation or obliteration. It's worth thinking about what the bombing of Nagasaki tells us about the world on this grim anniversary. Apart from the horror of the events, the bombings made it clear that human intelligence had contrived the means to destroy everything. We have lived under that shadow ever since, and it is darkening right now as we meet. The events of 1945 led to the establishment of the doomsday clock. Every year, January, a group of scientists and political analysts meet to assess the state of the world and to try to encapsulate it in the setting of the hands of the doomsday clock. The hands are set a certain distance from midnight. Midnight signals the end. The first setting, shortly after the bombings, the minute hand was set at 7 minutes to midnight. In 1953, it moved to 2 minutes to midnight. 1953, the United States and the Soviet Union exploded thermonuclear weapons. These did have the capacity for essentially total destruction. Since that time, the minute hand has oscillated, depending on the state of the world, never returned back to 2 minutes to midnight until the Trump presidency. Every year that Trump was in office, the minute hand was moved closer to midnight. 2 years ago, it reached 2 minutes to midnight, the highest it had been. Next year moved beyond. Finally, last year, Trump's last year in office, the analysts abandoned minutes. They moved to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. That's where it is now. Fair assessment, I think. The analysts identify 3 major crises. One of them, of course, is nuclear war. The second is destruction of the environment. The third is the deterioration of rational discourse. It may sound at first as though the third does not qualify, does not rank with the two existential threats, serious as it may be. That's a mistake. It does qualify. The reason is that the only hope for confronting the two existential crises is through rational deliberation and planning, guided by an informed citizenry. So the three crises are the right choice. And I'd like now to consider the three crises in turn, where they stand, what we can do about them. Start with the nuclear threat. The major nuclear powers are obligated by the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty. Sorry, I'll quote it now. Obligates them to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. That's a legal obligation of all the veto having members of the Security Council, all five of them. They're pursuing the opposite course. The leading monitor on these issues is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. Its last annual survey reports, I'll quote it, that the growth in total spending in 2020 was largely influenced by expenditure patterns in the United States and China. The USA increased its military spending for the third straight year to reach $778 billion in 1920. Second is China, which increased to $252 billion. In fourth place, behind India, is the second US adversary, Russia, $62 billion. So think of those figures. United States, $778 billion. China, $252 billion. Russia, $62 billion. Much of this spending is for modernizing and expanding nuclear forces. The figures are instructive, but they're misleading. The United States is alone in not facing any credible security threats. Threats are, in fact, constantly alleged when there are incessant demands for even more military spending. But ask yourself, where are these threats? Are they off the coasts of New York and Los Angeles? Hardly. The alleged threats are at the borders of adversaries, China and Russia, which do face real threats at their borders. They are, in fact, both of them, ringed with US nuclear-armed missiles aiming at them, deployed in some of the 800 military bases of the United States around the world, many of them adjacent to China and Russia. China has one military base in Africa, in Djibouti. The United States does face real threats. The development of new and more dangerous weapon systems. That's a suicidal enterprise in which the United States plays a leading role. There is a way to deal with these threats. They could be banned by treaties. Treaties have indeed worked very well as long as they were in effect. They've been dismantled in this century by the Republican presidents, first George W. Bush, but primarily Donald Trump. Only one treaty survived Trump's wrecking ball, survived literally by days. The last major treaty that Trump didn't dismantle was the New START Treaty, which limits Russian US nuclear arsenals. The Russians had been calling for extension of the treaty. No response from Washington. On February 5th, just as the treaty was to expire, Joe Biden, who had just been just taken office, was able to accept the Russian offers and to extend the treaty. That's the one that stands. And so far, there's been no effort to resurrect the others. Well, the current mythology that's concocted to justify escalation of this suicidal enterprise is almost embarrassingly silly. If you're interested, it's very carefully analyzed, dismantled by nuclear physicist Lawrence Krauss, who for many years had the responsibility to present publicly the setting of the clock. Can send the link if you're interested. Krauss also reminds us, I'm quoting him, that the United States and Russia have both come within seconds of launching nuclear weapons due to software or human errors that erroneously indicated an incoming nuclear missile strike. This has happened repeatedly, dozens, if not hundreds of times. And the two countries now have more than 5,000 nuclear weapons each, with more than 1,000 of those on high alert, launch on warning status, meaning as soon as there's any notification, just send them off. They're just waiting for another accident or some crazed human decision. That decision might be by someone well down the chain of command. We learned that from Daniel Ellsberg, who released information from the very center of high-level planning in his essential book, The Doomsday Machine. The bloated military budget could be sharply cut without harm to authentic security. In fact, cutting the budget sharply would enhance genuine security if it were undertaken within a project of international cooperation. That's not an idle dream, as history reveals. And it would, of course, free up badly needed funds for urgent necessities. But it's not to be under present circumstances. The military budget remains untouchable by bipartisan agreement. Not total agreement. For some, the monstrous military budget is not enough. 3 highly influential Republican senators have just introduced an amendment to the bipartisan infrastructure bill, major bill that's now being debated in Congress. Their amendment calls for yet another $50 billion for the undernourished Pentagon, which already accounts for about 40% of global military spending, dwarfing potential adversaries who, unlike the United States, are under direct threat of devastating attack right at their borders. One consequence of this madness is a substantial contribution to environmental destruction. Recent studies show, I'm quoting, that the United States military is one of the largest polluters in history, consuming more liquid fuels and emitting more climate-changing gases than most medium-sized countries. And that, of course, extends on a lesser scale to the other militarized powers. That brings us to the second factor in setting the doomsday clock, the one threat to survival of organized human life that compares with nuclear war: environmental destruction. For years, thousands of scientists have been joining to issue warnings of what they call a climate emergency. Thousands more are joining the call right now as the world is swept with disasters intensified by heating of the atmosphere. 3 years ago, a warning was given by Oxford physicist Raymond Pierre Humbert. He's the lead author of the report of the IPCC, the International Organization of Climate Scientists. Scientists of almost 200 countries issues the regular reports on the climate. Pierre Humbert wrote that it's time to panic. We are in deep trouble. That was 3 years ago. What we have learned since only intensifies the warning. Reports in scientific journals regularly reveal that previous assessments have been too conservative. The latest report of the IPCC was just released today. I'll come back to it. A draft was leaked to the press in June. It listed irreversible tipping points that are ominously close. Once we reach them, can do nothing more about them. It's on to disaster. The draft report warned of, quoting again, progressively serious, centuries-long, in some cases, irreversible consequences. That was June. The leaked IPCC report was written before the extreme weather events of the summer 2021, events which have shocked climate scientists. One prominent analyst, Michael Mann, observed that heating of the planet is pretty much in line with climate model predictions from decades ago, but the rise in extreme weather is far exceeding these predictions. The reason seems to be an effect of heating the atmosphere that had not been considered in climate studies. It has led to wobbling of the jet stream, the huge flood of air that circulates around the Arctic. The jet stream has begun to wobble under the effect of global warming, and that's what's been causing the extreme events that plagued much of the world in the past few weeks. Horrible floods, terrible fires, heating, fires so great they've actually destroyed towns in the United States, all over the world, China as well, Australia. Well, Brazil is making its own monumental contribution to this disaster. As you all know, under Bolsonaro, destruction of the Amazon has been rapidly accelerating in the interests of mining, agribusiness, and lumber industries. It had been estimated by climate scientists that in the not too distant future, the Amazon would reach a critical tipping point. The Amazon has been a sink, one of the major sinks for carbon. It absorbs carbon from the atmosphere, but at the tipping point, it would shift from being a sink to a source of producing carbon into the atmosphere. That was expected to happen in several decades. Brazilian scientists have just demonstrated that it's already happening far before what was anticipated. Southeastern Amazon has now shifted from a sink to a source. For Brazil, that's a catastrophe. The Amazon itself will revert to savanna, grasslands. Rainfall will sharply decrease. Rich agricultural areas in the south will become desert. For the indigenous people who live there, it means genocide. That's a particularly ironic tragedy, since they have been in the forefront, worldwide in fact, in defending the environment from destruction. This is a far worse crime than the COVID massacre, which has been caused by Bolsonaro's incompetence and corruption. It's an indescribable catastrophe for Brazil and for the world. The Amazon has been a major sink for global carbon. It's a major oxygen source for the world. That's all to disappear. Well, as I'm speaking, August 9th, the IPCC report has just been released. It concludes with certainty that within 20 years, we will reach the level of 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. That's the danger level that was set by the original Paris Agreement in 2015, with the plan to keep from reaching that level. Now, with certainty, we're reaching it very shortly, 20 years. And on the current trajectory, the report continues, the average temperature might go as high as 4.4 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. That's an apocalypse, an indescribable apocalypse. Sea levels will rise almost 2 meters. Much of the earth will be uninhabitable. And a lot is unknown. The climate is entering new territory. CO2 levels today are as high as they were 2 million years ago. The report also describes feasible means to maintain temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius. If that's done, the climate could stabilize, humanity could adapt at no slight cost, but without apocalypse.
Os melhores professores, os melhores cursos e o melhor preço, só no ICL.